"If you marry him, Grace, you'll never paint again." The words hung in the air of the cramped Soho studio like smoke from the oil lamps, and Lady Grace Ashford felt them pierce through the silk corset that had bound her since childhood, not just the fabric kind, but the invisible ones woven from duty, expectation, and fear. London, 1878. The city sprawled beneath a perpetual veil of fog, as if the heavens themselves sought to hide the secrets festering in its streets. In the grand townhouses of Mayfair, crystal chandeliers cast their judgmental light upon women who smiled with painted lips while their souls slowly suffocated. In the narrow alleys of Soho, artists starved and dreamed, their fingers stained with pigments more precious than the blood running through aristocratic veins. And Grace lived between these two worlds, her heart a compass needle spinning wildly, unable to find true north. She stood now in Thomas Bennett's studio, a third-floor walk-up, where the floorboards creaked and the ceiling leaked when it rained, where canvases leaned against every wall like soldiers awaiting orders. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil had become more familiar to her than her own perfume. Parisian rosewater that cost more than Thomas earned in a month. "You don't understand," she whispered, though her voice carried the weight of someone who knew with terrible certainty that he understood perfectly. "Edmund Blackwood he's the Queen's most trusted legal counsel," Thomas finished, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. He stood before his easel, his shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with the strength of a man who'd built his own life from nothing. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and his eyes, God, those eyes, held an intensity that made her forget she was a lady. "Advisor to the Prime Minister, the man who drafts the laws that govern this empire. The man I'm expected to marry," Grace said, and the words tasted like ash. Thomas turned away, his hand gripping the paintbrush so tightly she feared it might snap. On the canvas before him, a portrait emerged. Her portrait, though not as society had ever seen her. In his painting, her hair tumbled loose over her shoulders, her expression wild and free, her hands stained with paint. The woman in that portrait didn't attend garden parties or make polite conversation about the weather. She created, she lived, she breathed. "When?" Thomas asked, his back still to her. "The engagement will be announced at the Lord Chancellor's ball, 3 weeks from tonight." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of London. Carriage wheels on cobblestones, street vendors calling their wares, the eternal heartbeat of a city that cared nothing for the dramas unfolding in its hidden corners. But to understand how Grace had arrived at this impossible moment, we must return to where it all began. 6 months earlier, to a stifling August evening when the heat had driven even the most proper ladies to fan themselves with abandon, and when Grace Ashford had made the first rebellious choice of her carefully orchestrated life. Lady Grace Ashford was 23 years old, the only daughter of the Earl of Wexford, and she had been groomed since birth for a single purpose: to marry brilliantly and maintain her family's position in the highest echelons of British society. Her mother, the Countess, had mapped out her future with the precision of a military campaign. Her father, distracted by politics and brandy, had simply nodded his approval. Grace was beautiful. This was stated as fact in every London drawing room. Honey-coloured hair that she wore in the fashionable styles, though it longed to escape its pins. Green eyes that reminded people of English meadows, though they held storms no one bothered to see. A figure that fit perfectly into the expensive gowns her mother ordered from Paris. A smile that had been practiced in mirrors until it could be deployed at precisely the right moments. But there was something else about Grace. Something that made her mother frown with worry late at night. A restlessness. A hunger for something beyond the endless cycle of balls, teas, and meaningless conversations. A tendency to stare out windows at the London skyline and wonder what lay beyond the gilded cage of her existence. "You're fortunate, Grace," her mother had told her 1,000 times. "Not every girl of quality attracts the attention of a man like Mr. Blackwood." Edmund Blackwood. Even his name sounded like power. At 35, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in London, not through title or inherited wealth, but through sheer brilliance and political acumen. The son of a country solicitor, he had clawed his way to the top through Cambridge, through the courts, through the labyrinthine corridors of Westminster, until Queen Victoria herself had taken notice. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often are, tall, impeccably dressed, with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. His eyes were sharp, analytical, missing nothing. When he spoke, people listened. When he entered a room, conversations paused, and he had chosen Grace. Their courtship had been proper, public, perfect. Chaperoned walks in Hyde Park, attendance at the opera, where he would explain the political allegories in the performances, dinner parties where he would discuss cases he'd argued before the House of Lords, and Grace would nod and smile and feel her soul slowly dying. Because Edmund Blackwood never asked her what she thought. He never inquired about her dreams, her fears, her secret longings. He saw her as the perfect ornament for the life he was building. Beautiful, well-bred, appropriately educated, but not threateningly intelligent. "You'll make an excellent wife," he had told her once, and she had heard the unspoken completion of that sentence. "You'll make an excellent accessory to my ambitions." But then came that August evening, and everything changed. The Countess had dragged Grace to a charity exhibition at the Royal Academy, one of those tedious affairs where wealthy patrons pretended to appreciate art while really just seeing and being seen. Grace had worn a gown of pale blue silk that cost enough to feed a family for a year, and she had smiled until her cheeks ached. And then she had seen the painting. It hung in a corner, away from the main galleries, as if the curators weren't quite sure what to do with it. The subject was simple, a woman at a window, looking out at the rain. But something in the way the light fell across her face, the yearning in her posture, the sense of a soul trapped behind glass, it had stopped Grace in her tracks. She had stood there transfixed, while her mother chatted with other ladies about the disappointing selection this year. The painting spoke to something deep inside her, something she had tried to bury under layers of propriety and duty. "She's waiting for someone who'll never come." The voice had come from beside her, rough, unpolished, utterly unlike the refined tones of her usual circle. Grace had turned to find a young man in paint-stained clothes, clearly not a patron, but one of the artists themselves. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that held both sadness and fire. "How do you know?" Grace had asked, forgetting for a moment that she shouldn't engage in conversation with strange men, especially ones who looked like they'd never seen the inside of a gentleman's club. "Because I painted her," he had said simply, "and I know about waiting for things that can never be." That should have been the end of it. Grace should have smiled politely, moved on, forgotten the encounter, but instead she had asked, "What are you waiting for?" He had looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that no one ever had. Not at her dress or her hair or her practiced smile, but at her, the person hiding beneath all those layers of silk and expectation. "Freedom," he had said. "The freedom to create without starving. The freedom to see beauty and capture it without asking permission. The freedom to live as I choose, not as society demands." And in that moment, something inside Grace had cracked open like an egg, spilling out all the yearning she'd kept locked away for 23 years. "Grace, come along, we're leaving," her mother had called, her voice sharp with disapproval at finding her daughter speaking to someone so clearly beneath their station. Grace had hurried away, but not before the young man had pressed something into her hand, a small card with an address in Soho and a single word, Tuesday. She should have thrown it away, should have forgotten the whole encounter, should have continued down the path that had been laid out for her since birth. Instead, the following Tuesday, she had told her maid she was visiting a friend, hired a hansom cab, and found herself climbing the narrow stairs to Thomas Bennett's studio. That first visit had lasted an hour. Grace had stood awkwardly in the doorway, uncertain why she'd come, while Thomas had simply continued working on a landscape, occasionally glancing at her with an expression she couldn't read. They had barely spoken, yet something had passed between them in that silence, a recognition, perhaps of two souls equally trapped by different prisons. The second Tuesday she had stayed longer. Thomas had shown her his other works, portraits of street vendors and factory workers, landscapes of London's forgotten corners, still lifes that somehow captured the melancholy beauty of poverty. His talent was undeniable, raw and honest in a way that the celebrated Academy painters could never be. "Why don't you paint what they want to see?" Grace had asked, gesturing to a portrait of an old woman selling flowers in Covent Garden. "You could make a fortune painting flattering portraits of wealthy ladies." Thomas had laughed, a sound both bitter and amused. "Because then I'd be no different from them, selling my soul for comfort. I paint what's true, Lady Grace, even if it means I'll never be rich." Lady Grace. He had learned her title somehow, though she'd never given him her full name. She should have been offended by his presumption, by his refusal to properly address her. Instead, she had felt oddly liberated by it. By the third Tuesday, he had asked if she'd ever tried to paint. "Once," Grace had admitted, surprising herself with the confession. "When I was 12. My governess found me with watercolors, trying to capture the way light fell through the morning room windows. My mother threw them all away. She said painting was an unsuitable hobby for a young lady of quality. It made one's hands dirty and gave one peculiar ideas." "Bzz, and did it?" Thomas had asked, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "Give you peculiar ideas?" "Yes," Grace had whispered. "It made me think that perhaps there was more to life than needlepoint and polite conversation." That day, Thomas had set up a small easel for her. He had shown her how to mix colors, how to see light and shadow, how to translate the world onto canvas. Grace's first attempts had been clumsy, childish even, but Thomas had never laughed or condescended. Instead, he had guided her hand with patience, teaching her to trust her instincts, to stop thinking and simply feel. Those Tuesday visits had become the center of Grace's existence. She lived for them, counted down the days between them, lay awake at night, replaying every conversation, every accidental touch of hands when Thomas adjusted her brush grip, every moment when their eyes met and something electric passed between them. She began to paint in earnest, not just copying what she saw, but pouring her emotions onto canvas. The frustration of her confined life, the suffocation of expectations, the desperate hunger for something real, something true, something that belonged to her alone. And Thomas had begun to paint her, not as a subject posing in his studio, but from memory. Grace as she looked when she forgot to maintain her practiced composure, when she laughed at something he said, when she lost herself in her work, and her hair came loose, and her cheeks flushed with concentration. They never spoke of it directly, the thing growing between them. It was too dangerous, too impossible. Thomas had nothing to offer her but poverty and scandal. Grace had everything to lose: her family's position, her reputation, her future. The very idea of a connection between an earl's daughter and a penniless artist was absurd, laughable, ruinous. But the heart, Grace was discovering, cared nothing for logic or social hierarchies. Meanwhile, her official courtship with Edmund Blackwood continued its inevitable progression. He had formally asked her father for her hand in October, and the Earl, thrilled at the prospect of connecting his family to such political power, had agreed immediately. Grace's opinion had not been solicited, it had been assumed. "You're very quiet this evening," Edmund had observed during one of their carefully chaperoned dinners. "Is something troubling you?" How could she explain that she felt like a bird being slowly pressed between the pages of a book, that every smile she gave him felt like a betrayal of herself, that there was a man in Soho who saw her not as an ornament, but as a person, who encouraged her to create rather than simply be beautiful, who made her feel alive in a way Edmund never had and never would. "I'm simply overwhelmed by the honor you've done me," Grace had said instead, and hated herself for the lie. Edmund had patted her hand in what he surely thought was a comforting gesture. "You needn't be nervous, my dear. You'll have everything you could possibly want. A fine house, servants, position in society. The Queen herself has expressed her approval of our match. Everything she could possibly want, except the freedom to be herself." The weeks passed, and Grace felt herself being pulled apart. In Mayfair, she played her role perfectly. The dutiful daughter, the grateful fiancée, the proper lady. She attended Edmund's functions, smiled at his colleagues, made appropriate small talk about nothing of consequence. She allowed herself to be fitted for a wedding gown that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But on Tuesdays, she came alive. In Thomas's studio, she could breathe. She painted until her hands ached, talked until her voice grew hoarse, laughed in a way she never did in drawing rooms. Thomas challenged her, questioned her, pushed her to think beyond the narrow confines of her upbringing. "What do you believe, Grace?" he had asked her one afternoon as they worked side by side. She on a portrait of a street urchin he'd sketched, he on his mysterious canvas he never let her see. About what? About anything, everything. "I've heard you repeat your mother's opinions, your father's politics, Blackwood's legal theories, but what do you think? What do you feel? What do you want?" The question had struck her like a physical blow. No one had ever asked her that. No one had ever cared. Grace had stood there, brushed dripping paint onto the floor, and felt tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she had whispered. "I've never been allowed to know." Thomas had set down his brush and crossed to her. For a moment, she had thought he might embrace her, and she both longed for and feared that touch. Instead, he had simply stood close enough that she could feel his warmth, his presence, his absolute attention. "Then find out," he had said quietly, "before it's too late, before you become Mrs. Edmund Blackwood, and spend the rest of your life wondering who Lady Grace Ashford might have been." That conversation had haunted her for weeks. It echoed through the hollow spaces of her engagement parties, whispered through the rustle of her silk gowns, shouted in the silence of her lonely bedroom at night. And then, 3 weeks before the official announcement of her engagement, everything had come crashing down. Grace had been returning from Thomas's studio, her maid Margaret, who had become complicit in these secret visits, beside her in the hansom cab. They had been discussing a painting Grace was working on, laughing about her struggles with getting the proportions right, when the cab had stopped at a traffic snarl near Piccadilly. And there, in another carriage passing just feet away, sat Edmund Blackwood. Their eyes had met. Grace had seen the recognition in his face, followed immediately by confusion, then calculation. He had seen her coming from the direction of Soho, dressed simply, her face flushed with happiness she never showed in his presence. The next day, she had received a note requesting her presence at his office in Westminster. Grace had entered that imposing building with dread sitting like a stone in her stomach. Edmund's office was all dark wood and leather, walls lined with law books and political treatises. He had been standing at the window, looking out over London, his hands clasped behind his back. "Grace," he had said without turning, "I've been making inquiries about your activities." Her heart had begun to race. "I don't know what you mean. Please don't insult my intelligence." He had turned then, his face composed, but his eyes sharp as broken glass. "You've been seen entering a building in Soho repeatedly, every Tuesday for the past 4 months. A building that houses, among other things, the studio of a Mr. Thomas Bennet, artist of dubious talent and certain poverty." Grace had felt the world tilting beneath her feet. "Edmund, I can explain." "Can you?" He had walked toward her slowly, like a barrister approaching a hostile witness. "Can you explain why my intended bride has been visiting the lodgings of a common artist? Why she has been lying to her parents, deceiving her chaperone, engaging in behavior that, if made public, would destroy not only her reputation but mine as well?" "I've done nothing improper," Grace had insisted, though her voice shook. "Mr. Bennet has been teaching me to paint. That's all. We're never alone. My maid is always present. There's been no impropriety." "No impropriety?" Edmund's laugh had been cold. "You think that matters? You think society cares about the truth? The mere suggestion that the future wife of the Queen's legal counsel has been consorting with a penniless artist would be enough to ruin us both. Do you have any idea how many enemies I've made in my rise to power? How many people would delight in seeing me fall?" For the first time, Grace had seen past Edmund's controlled exterior to the ambition beneath. She wasn't a person to him. She was a chess piece, a political asset, a means to further consolidate his power and respectability. "This ends now," Edmund had continued, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will cease these visits immediately. You will never see this man again. And you will ensure that he understands the consequences should he ever attempt to contact you or make public any details of your association." "And if I refuse?" The question had escaped before Grace could stop it, surprising them both. Edmund's eyes had narrowed. "Then I will have no choice but to inform your father, and I will ensure that Mr. Bennet finds it impossible to sell his work anywhere in London. I have connections, Grace. I can destroy him with a word. Is your little hobby worth ruining a man's life?" The threat had been clear, and Grace had known Edmund had both the power and the ruthlessness to carry it out. She had left his office, feeling as though she'd been physically beaten, every breath an effort. That evening, she had broken her usual schedule and gone to Thomas's studio. She had climbed those familiar stairs with legs that felt like lead, each step taking her closer to a goodbye she wasn't ready to say. Thomas had known immediately that something was wrong. He had guided her to the worn settee in the corner, brought her tea in a chipped cup, waited patiently while she gathered the courage to speak. "I can't come back here," Grace had finally said, the words tearing themselves from her throat. "Edmund knows. He's threatened to destroy you if I continue to visit. I'm so sorry, Thomas. I've put you in danger simply by being selfish enough to come here." Thomas had been quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he had stood and walked to his easel, turning it so Grace could finally see the canvas he'd been working on for weeks. It was her, but not just a portrait. It was Grace as she truly was, as no one else had ever seen her. In the painting, she stood at a window, much like the woman in the painting that had first drawn her to Thomas's work. But unlike that woman who waited for someone who would never come, this Grace was stepping through the window, one foot already outside, her face turned toward an unseen horizon, her expression a mixture of fear and exhilaration and desperate hope. "I call it freedom," Thomas had said quietly. "I've been painting what I see when I look at you, Grace. Not Lady Grace Ashford, the Earl's daughter. Not the future Mrs. Blackwood, the political wife. Just Grace. The woman who's been slowly dying behind all those expectations and obligations." Grace had stared at the painting, tears streaming down her face. "I love you," Thomas had said, and the words hung in the air like a confession, a prayer, a benediction. I've loved you since that first day at the Royal Academy when you looked at my painting like it held the secrets of the universe. I've loved you through every Tuesday, watching you discover yourself, seeing you come alive with brush in hand, and I love you enough to let you go if that's what you must do. Thomas. But before you walk away, he had continued, his voice rough with emotion, I want you to know that there is another choice. It won't be easy. It will mean scandal, poverty, losing everything you've ever known. But it will be real, Grace. It will be yours. We could leave London, go to Paris or Italy where no one knows us. I could teach, paint for whomever will buy. You could create without shame or hiding. We could be poor but free, struggling but honest, together but our own people. Grace had looked at him, really looked at him. Thomas Bennet, who had nothing but his talent and his integrity, who saw her not as an ornament or an asset, but as a complete person worthy of love and respect, who offered her not comfort or security, but truth and freedom. And then she thought of Edmund Blackwood, with his power and his cold calculation, of her parents who had raised her to be a beautiful bargaining chip in society's endless games, of the life that awaited her, comfortable, respectable, and slowly suffocating. I need time, Grace had whispered. The engagement announcement is in 3 weeks. Let me think. Let me find a way that doesn't destroy you in the process. Thomas had nodded, though she could see the hurt in his eyes at her hesitation. 3 weeks then. But Grace, whatever you decide, and know this, you deserve more than a life spent making yourself smaller so others can feel larger. Grace had fled then, unable to bear the weight of his love and her own cowardice. She had returned to Mayfair, to her bedroom with its silk wallpaper and crystal lamps, and she had cried until no more tears would come. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Grace went through the motions of her engagement, dress fittings, menu selections for the wedding breakfast, accepting congratulations from people who barely knew her. She smiled and nodded and played her part while inside, her heart was tearing itself apart. She painted in secret now, in her room late at night when the house was sleeping. Dark, violent canvases that expressed everything she couldn't say aloud. She painted cages and chains and windows that wouldn't open. She painted Thomas's studio as a remembered paradise. She painted herself as she feared she would become. A beautiful, hollow shell with dead eyes and a practiced smile. Edmund, satisfied that his warning had been heeded, resumed his attentions. He took her to dinner with the Prime Minister, where she sat silent and ornamental, while the men discussed the Irish question and the expansion of the empire. He brought her to the opera, where she watched tragic heroines die for love, while he calculated the political implications of the subplot. "You've been very compliant lately," Edmund had remarked one evening. "I appreciate that you've seen reason regarding your little artistic diversion. Such frivolities are beneath a woman of your position, in any case." Grace had said nothing, but in that moment, she had known with absolute certainty that she could not marry this man. She would die, slowly but surely, if she became Mrs. Edmund Blackwood. The question was whether she had the courage to choose life. The week before the engagement announcement, Grace's father had called her into his study. The Earl of Wexford was not a deliberately cruel man, simply a distracted one who had long ago decided that his daughter's life was his wife's concern. "Your mother tells me you've seemed melancholy," he had said, pouring himself a brandy. "Nerves about the wedding, I expect. Perfectly normal." "Father," Grace had heard herself say, "what if I don't want to marry Mr. Blackwood?" The Earl had looked at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "Don't want to? My dear girl, wanting has nothing to do with it. Blackwood is the most brilliant political mind of his generation. This marriage will elevate our family's position immeasurably. Your children will move in the highest circles. What more could you possibly want?" To be happy, Grace had whispered. Her father had laughed, not unkindly, but with the patronizing amusement of someone addressing a child. Happiness is a luxury, Grace. We are aristocrats. We have duty, responsibility, legacy. You'll learn to be content as your mother has, as her mother before her. Now run along. Your mother needs you for some last preparations. Grace had left his study understanding, finally, that there would be no help from her family. If she was to save herself, she would have to do it alone. 2 nights before the Lord Chancellor's ball, where her engagement would be announced, Grace had sneaked out of her house for the first time in her life. She had waited until the household slept, dressed in her simplest gown, and slipped through the servants' entrance. The streets of London at midnight were simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, dark, dangerous, and completely unlike the sanitized version of the city she'd always known. She had made her way to Soho, to Thomas's building, and had climbed those stairs one last time. Thomas had opened the door in his shirt sleeves, his hair disheveled, clearly having been working through the night. When he saw her, his face had gone through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. "Grace? My God, do you know what time it is? Does anyone know you're here?" "No one knows," she had said, stepping inside. "And I don't care. I had to see you. I had to tell you." But the words had stuck in her throat, because this was the moment. The choice, the irrevocable step that would change everything. In the studio, surrounded by Thomas's canvases and the smell of paint, Grace had felt more at home than she ever had in her father's mansion. "If you marry him, Grace, you'll never paint again." And there they were, back at the beginning, at the moment that had started everything. Thomas waiting for her answer. Grace's whole future balanced on the edge of a knife. "I know," Grace had finally said, "and I've realized something, Thomas. I don't want to paint. I mean, I do, but that's not really what this is about, is it? It's about whether I have the courage to be myself, to make my own choices, to live my own life, even if it means losing everything I've been taught to value." She had crossed to him then, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to feel his breath on her face. "I'm terrified," she had confessed. "Terrified of poverty, of scandal, of my family's rejection, terrified that I'm making a horrible mistake. But I'm more terrified of waking up 20 years from now as Mrs. Edmund Blackwood, looking in the mirror at a stranger, wondering what happened to Grace Ashford." "What are you saying?" Thomas had asked, though hope had been dawning in his eyes. "I'm saying yes, to Paris, to poverty, to freedom, to you." Grace had laughed, a sound halfway between joy and hysteria. "I'm saying I choose myself, and I choose you, and I choose a life that's real, even if it's hard. I'm saying I'd rather starve creating art in a garret than suffocate in a mansion full of things I don't want." Thomas had pulled her into his arms then, and Grace had felt for the first time in her life what it meant to be truly held, truly seen, truly loved. Not for her beauty or her breeding or her potential usefulness, but for who she actually was. "We'll have to leave immediately," Thomas had said, his voice urgent against her hair. "Tonight, before anyone can stop us, before Blackwood can use his influence to prevent us from leaving the country. I have some money saved, enough for passage to Calais and perhaps a month's lodging in Paris. After that, we'll find a way," Grace had finished. "Together." They had worked quickly, Thomas packing his essential supplies and his most important canvases, while Grace wrote 2 letters, one to her parents, trying to explain the inexplicable, and one to Edmund, releasing him from their engagement and apologizing for the scandal she was about to cause. "Before, I want to thank each of you, from the bottom of my heart, for being here with me on this journey. Knowing that my voice reaches you, bringing these stories that mean so much to me, is truly special. Every view, every moment you spend here matters more than you know. Now brace yourselves, because what happens next will change everything. As dawn broke over London, Grace and Thomas made their way to the docks. Grace wore a simple traveling dress and carried nothing but a small bag, everything she owned of her former life abandoned. With each step away from Mayfair, she felt simultaneously more terrified and more alive. The crossing to France was rough, and Grace spent most of it on deck despite the spray, watching England recede into the distance. She thought of her mother waking to find her gone, of the scandal that would erupt when the letters were discovered, of Edmund's cold fury. She thought of everything she was losing: comfort, security, her family's love. And yet, standing there with Thomas's hand in hers, Grace found she could breathe fully for the first time in her life. Paris in November was cold and grey and utterly magnificent. They found lodging in Montmartre, a tiny room in a building full of artists and writers and other refugees from conventional society. The room had a single bed, a small stove, one window that looked out over the chaotic beauty of the city, and nothing else. It was perfect. The first weeks were harder than Grace had imagined. She'd never cooked a meal, never washed her own clothes, never worried about whether she could afford bread. Thomas worked constantly, taking any commission he could find, painting portraits for tourists, teaching drawing to pay their rent. Grace took in mending, her needlework skills, cultivated for decorative purposes, now pressed into practical service. They were often hungry, their clothes grew shabby. The Paris winter seeped through the walls of their inadequate room. Grace's hands, once soft and pampered, grew chapped and rough. There were nights when she lay awake wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake, if pride and stubbornness had led her to ruin. But there were also mornings when she woke beside Thomas, truly woke without the dread that had characterized her life in London. There were afternoons painting side by side in the weak winter sunlight. There were evenings discussing philosophy with other artists over cheap wine. There were moments of laughter and creation and genuine connection that made all the hardship worthwhile. Slowly, Grace began to find herself, not the self that had been constructed for her, but the person she actually was. She discovered she had strong opinions about art, politics, justice. She found she could be stubborn, passionate, occasionally quite funny. She learned that she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. And she painted. Not the tentative, careful work of her early days in Thomas's studio, but bold, honest canvases that captured her journey from cage to freedom. Her work was raw, emotional, sometimes technically flawed, but undeniably powerful. 3 months after their flight from London, Thomas sold one of Grace's paintings to a gallery owner who specialized in new artists. It wasn't much money, but it was the first thing Grace had ever earned through her own efforts, and she had wept with pride. Meanwhile, back in London, the scandal had erupted exactly as Grace had feared. The newspapers had been merciless. Earl's daughter elopes with penniless artist, Blackwood jilted, political future in question, Lady Grace's fall from grace. Her parents had disowned her publicly, though her mother had sent one letter, brief and bitter, wishing her daughter had chosen death over such disgrace. Edmund Blackwood, ever the political strategist, had managed the scandal brilliantly. He had positioned himself as the wronged party, the honorable man betrayed by a foolish girl's romantic delusions. Within weeks, he was being courted by mothers with marriageable daughters, his stock paradoxically risen by his perceived suffering. Within months, he would announce his engagement to a duke's daughter, better connected than Grace had ever been, and far more compliant. I'm so curious. What country or state are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments below. It amazes me how these stories travel across the world and touch hearts in places I've never been. I can't wait to see where you all are joining me from. Now prepare yourself, because the intensity is about to reach its peak. Grace learned all this through letters from Margaret, her former maid, who had been dismissed from service for her role in the deception, but who remained steadfastly loyal. Margaret's letters painted a picture of a London that had moved on, as London always did, to the next scandal, the next drama. But then, 6 months after Grace's flight, Margaret's letters brought different news that made Grace's blood run cold and her heart race with a fear she hadn't felt since leaving England. Edmund Blackwood had not, it seemed, moved on as completely as it appeared. He had been making inquiries, using his extensive network of contacts throughout Europe. He had learned where Grace was living, and he was coming to Paris. "He wants to meet with you," Margaret had written. "He's told people it's about settling some legal matters related to the broken engagement. But Grace, I don't trust him. He's obsessed with the idea that you made him look foolish. Please be careful." Thomas had wanted to forbid the meeting, to protect Grace from whatever Blackwood might intend. But Grace had realized she couldn't run forever. Some part of her needed closure, needed to face the man she'd once been prepared to marry, and confirm that her choice had been the right one. They agreed to meet in a cafe in the Latin Quarter. Neutral ground, public, safe. Grace arrived with Thomas, though Edmund had requested she come alone. She no longer cared what Edmund Blackwood requested. Edmund looked older than she remembered, harder. He sat at a corner table, impeccably dressed, even in exile, a cup of coffee cooling before him. When he saw Grace, his eyes narrowed. "Lady Grace," he said, his voice dripping with irony on her title. "Or should I say Mrs. Bennet? Though I understand you and your artist didn't bother with the formality of marriage." "We're married in every way that matters," Grace replied, lifting her chin. Thomas stood beside her, his hand protectively on her shoulder. "What do you want, Edmund?" "Want?" Edmund's laugh was harsh. "I want many things, Grace. I want my reputation fully restored. I want the months I wasted courting you returned. I want the political capital I lost due to your betrayal. Since I can't have those things, I'll settle for what I can get." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sheaf of papers, spreading them on the table. Grace saw with dawning horror that they were sketches, her sketches, from her time in Thomas's London studio, intimate personal drawings she'd never meant for anyone else to see. "Where did you get those?" Thomas demanded, his voice dangerous. "I have my methods," Edmund said smoothly. "Methods that also uncovered some interesting information about you, Mr. Bennet. Did you know that exhibiting indecent images carries serious penalties in England? That corrupting a young woman of quality could result in imprisonment? I have enough evidence here to ensure you never work as an artist again, in England or anywhere else in Europe where I have influence." "Those aren't indecent," Grace protested. "They're art, studies, nothing more than—" "That depends entirely on how they're presented," Edmund interrupted. "And I'm very good at presenting things in the most damaging light possible. It's my profession, after all." "What do you want?" Grace asked again, though she was beginning to understand. "Admission of guilt," Edmund said simply. "A public statement from you, Lady Grace Ashford, that you were seduced, manipulated, that you made your choice under duress and false pretenses, that Mr. Bennet here took advantage of your youth and naivety. In return, I won't prosecute, won't use my influence to destroy his career, won't ensure that every door in European society closes in your faces." The silence that followed was broken only by the sounds of the cafe around them, conversations in French, the clink of cups, the eternal rhythm of a city that had seen 10,000 such dramas play out. "No," Grace said clearly. Edmund's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon." I said no. Grace leaned forward, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I won't lie. I won't betray Thomas or myself. You want me to say I was a victim, that I was deceived, because that narrative restores your pride and makes my choice about your dignity rather than my freedom. But I wasn't seduced or manipulated, Edmund. I made a choice. I chose Thomas because he sees me as a person, not a possession. I chose poverty and freedom over wealth and suffocation, and I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over. Then you're a fool, Edmund spat. Do you have any idea what you're giving up? I could still offer you a way back, Grace. Your family might be persuaded to forgive. Society has short memory for those willing to properly repent. You could have everything back. Everything except myself, Grace interrupted. Everything except the right to make my own choices, to be my own person, to love whom I choose. You still don't understand, Edmund. That's not a sacrifice for me. That's the victory. That's the whole point. She stood, taking Thomas's hand. Do what you will with those sketches. Prosecute if you must. But I won't let you rewrite my story to soothe your wounded ego. I'm not the Lady Grace you tried to marry anymore. I'm just Grace, and I'm exactly who I choose to be. They had walked away then, leaving Edmund Blackwood sitting alone with his bitter coffee and his impotent threats. Grace had trembled for hours afterward, terrified of what consequences might follow. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. Margaret's next letter explained why. Edmund's new fiancée, the Duke's daughter, had gotten wind of his obsession with his former intended. She had issued an ultimatum: let go of the past or lose her and the advantageous connection her family represented. Edmund, ever the pragmatist, had chosen power over revenge. The sketches had been destroyed, the threats evaporated. Edmund Blackwood married his Duke's daughter and continued his rise through political circles, becoming Lord Chancellor within 5 years. He would live a long, successful life and die respected and mourned, and he would likely never think of Lady Grace Ashford again, except as a curious footnote in his history. Grace, meanwhile, discovered that Paris, in the late 1870s, was a city hungry for new artistic voices. Her paintings, raw, emotional, unflinchingly honest about women's inner lives, found an audience among the avant-garde galleries beginning to challenge traditional art world hierarchies. She would never be wealthy, never move in the circles she'd been born to, but she would be known, respected, free. Thomas's work, too, found recognition. His portraits of ordinary people, his landscapes of forgotten corners, his refusal to flatter or sanitize, all of it resonated in a city beginning to embrace realism over romanticism. They married finally in a small ceremony with artist friends as witnesses. Grace wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, and they exchanged rings made from bent nails that Thomas had hammered into shape. It was nothing like the society wedding she'd once been promised, and it was perfect. Years passed. Grace and Thomas left Paris for periods, traveling to Italy, to Spain, painting the light and life of the Mediterranean. They returned to settle in Montmartre, where they became fixtures of the artistic community. Grace, the English lady who'd given up everything for art, and Thomas, the talented painter who'd never compromised his vision. They had children, 3 of them, raised in cramped apartments full of canvases and creativity, taught that nobility came from integrity rather than breeding, that freedom was worth more than comfort, that love meant seeing and accepting someone as they truly were. Grace never reconciled with her parents. Her father died without speaking to her again. Her mother sent one letter near the end of her life, bitter, unforgiving, insisting that Grace's choices had brought shame on the family. Grace had wept when she read it, mourning not the loss of her mother's love, but the realization that she'd never really had it. Her mother had loved the idea of a daughter, a beautiful ornament, a useful tool. She'd never known or cared to know Grace herself. But Grace found family elsewhere. among the artists and writers and rebels of Paris, among the women who'd also dared to choose themselves over society's expectations, in the children she raised to question rather than obey, to create rather than conform. On Grace's 40th birthday, a gallery in Paris mounted a retrospective of her work. The exhibition was titled Cages and Windows, featuring paintings that traced her journey from her London days, those dark, desperate canvases of confinement, through her transformation to her current work celebrating freedom, love, and authentic living. The opening night was attended by everyone who mattered in the Paris art world. Critics praised her technical skill, her emotional depth, her unflinching honesty. One reviewer wrote that her work captured the essential struggle of the modern woman between the comfort of conformity and the terror and ecstasy of authentic existence. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by her work and her chosen family, Grace thought back to that August evening at the Royal Academy when she'd first seen Thomas's painting. She thought about the girl she'd been, afraid, confined, slowly dying behind the bars of expectation. She thought about Edmund Blackwood and the life she'd almost lived, the slow suffocation she'd escaped. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, coming up beside her, grey now threading through his dark hair, his face lined, but his eyes still holding that intensity that had first captivated her. Grace looked around the gallery at the paintings that chronicled her transformation, at the friends who'd become her true family, at the life she'd built through courage and stubbornness and sheer bloody-minded determination to be herself. "Only one," she said, and Thomas's face fell before she continued. "I regret that I almost didn't have the courage, that I almost chose safety over truth, that I almost became Mrs. Edmund Blackwood and spent my life wondering what might have been." She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "But I didn't. I chose this. The struggle, the poverty, the scandal, the freedom, the art, the love. I chose you and I chose myself, and I'd make that choice again every single day." Thomas pulled her close, and Grace thought about how many different kinds of love there were. Her parents had claimed to love her while trying to shape her into something useful. Edmund had offered a love that was really just ownership, but Thomas loved her enough to let her be fully herself, to encourage her wildness rather than tame it, to celebrate her strength rather than diminish it. "You know what the irony is?" Grace said, laughing against his shoulder. "They all thought I was making such a terrible sacrifice, giving up wealth and position and comfort for a life of poverty and scandal, but they had it backward. The real sacrifice would have been giving up myself. Everything else was just things." And so we reach the end of this journey together. I hope this story touched your heart as deeply as it touched mine in telling it. If you love this tale of courage, freedom, and the transformative power of choosing yourself, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next story I have waiting for you. Leave a comment telling me which moment moved you most. I read every single one, and your words mean the world to me. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling these stories with me. Until our next adventure together, remember that true nobility comes not from birth or wealth or position, but from the courage to live authentically, to love honestly, and to become fully yourself no matter the cost. The greatest masterpiece you'll ever create is your own life, lived on your own terms. Grace Ashford learned that truth, and perhaps in some small way, her story reminds us that we all have the power to choose freedom over comfort, truth over convention, and ourselves over the expectations of others. Until we meet again.